5 years after the Taliban marched back into Kabul, the guns have fallen largely silent across Afghanistan. But the resistance has not disappeared. In the mountains and valleys, and increasingly through attacks on Taliban positions elsewhere in the country, armed groups are still challenging the authority of the government that now controls Afghanistan. The National Resistance Front and the Afghan Freedom Front remain among the most active anti-Taliban forces, carrying out guerrilla attacks and trying to keep alive the idea that Taliban rule is not inevitable. But this is not the organised army that once fought alongside Western forces. The resistance is fragmented, divided between different commanders, political ambitions and visions for Afghanistan's future. And despite the attacks, the Taliban still control the country's territory, institution and main economic resources. For ordinary Afghans, that creates a painful contradiction. The Taliban say they brought security after decades of war. There are no longer American and NATO forces fighting across the country, and the Taliban have been able to present themselves as the authority capable of keeping Afghanistan together. But for many people, particularly women, minorities, and those who oppose the Taliban, the end of one war has not mean the end of fear. 5 years ago, many Afghans believed the Taliban takeover might be temporary. Today, children who were just beginning school when Kabul fell are growing up under Taliban rule. Girls who once imagined becoming doctors, teachers or journalists have watched those possibilities disappear. Families who supported the previous government or worked with foreign forces continue to worry about their safety. And for those who have remained, there is the daily calculation of what can be said, where they can go, and who they can trust. The armed resistance faces enormous obstacles. The Taliban have the advantage of controlling the state and its security forces, while their opponents lack a unified command, significant territory, or a single political program. That fragmentation is one of the greatest weaknesses of the resistance. There may be plenty of people who oppose Taliban rule, but opposition is not the same thing as an alternative government. Yet the fact that resistance continues matters. It tells the Taliban that control of Afghanistan does not necessarily mean acceptance of Taliban rule. It also tells Afghans who feel abandoned that there is still people willing to fight against what they see as repression. But there is a terrible human cost to that resistance. Every attack brings the possibility of retaliation. Every suspected fighter can place an entire family or community at risk. And then armed groups operate among civilian populations. Ordinary people can become trapped between those fighting the Taliban and the Taliban forces fighting back. That is the tragedy of Afghanistan 5 years on. There is no simple line between victory and defeat, security and fear, resistance and survival. The Taliban may control Afghanistan, but they have not convinced everyone living there that they have the right to define its future.
The resistance is also changing. In the early months after Kabul fell, the fight centred heavily on Panjshir, the historic heartland of opposition to the Taliban. The Taliban eventually seized the valley, forcing resistance fighters into guerrilla warfare. Since then, the conflict has become more dispersed, with attacks reported in several provinces rather than one clearly defined front line. That makes the resistance harder to eliminate, but it also makes it harder to turn into a credible political alternative. Different groups have different leaders and different priorities. Some want an inclusive political settlement, others are demanding a fundamental change to the Taliban system. And there remains a question of how much genuine support these armed groups have among a population exhausted by more than 4 decades of conflict. The Taliban, meanwhile, are trying to project an image of permanence. They have survived 5 years, maintained control of the major cities and institutions, and resisted international pressure for fundamental political change. But there are signs of vulnerability. Political violence has increased in some areas, particularly where local disputes and opposition attacks intersect with Taliban rule. And the Taliban are facing other pressures, including a deep humanitarian crisis and worsening tensions with neighbouring Pakistan. For Afghans, the greatest fear may be that the country becomes trapped between 2 impossible futures: Taliban rule that many reject and another cycle of war that nobody wants. 5 years after the fall of Kabul, the question is not simply whether the resistance can defeat the Taliban. It is whether Afghanistan can ever escape the cycle of violence that has defined so much of its modern history.
5 years after the Taliban returned to power, Afghanistan remains caught between the promise of stability and the reality of repression and resistance. The Taliban control the country, but armed groups continue to challenge their authority, keeping alive the possibility of another cycle of violence. For ordinary Afghans, the politics are secondary to survival. They want to feed their families, educate their children, and live without fear of soldiers arriving at their door. They have endured decades of war, displacement, and uncertainty. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is that after 5 years, so many still cannot see a peaceful future ahead.